All right, here we go for the live stream for the Revolutionary Era. So let's try to make this quick. I'm going to pull over to the classroom over here. So if you haven't noticed already, in our Google Classroom for this class, there is a video of me kind of running over through these notes, so if you want to listen to it again, and then a PowerPoint to kind of help focus your studying. There's really not going to be too much of anything that's not in this PowerPoint for this test slash quiz or whatever. So let's kind of get going, and let me know when you guys can hear me in the chat. That way we can kind of really get going. So where is the PowerPoint? Right here. Let's bring it up. Let's run. We're not going to run through all this. Sorry, my internet connection is running really slow today for some reason. That might be messing with your stream a little bit too. Weird. Why is this not loading? Let's try it a different way. What the heck? Let me download it. Well, if you give me a second, I'll bring it up in a different spot. Sorry, guys. Man, my computer is acting all sorts of funky right now. Guys, my internet is being super slow. I don't know why, so sorry if this stream cuts out for any reason here. Almost to the point where I can bring up this PowerPoint from a different spot off of Google Drive. You are offline. Maybe unavailable. Wow, this is really problematic. Sorry guys, still being super slow. I think this is really bad. I might need to restart my computer fast or something. My Google Drive keeps telling me that I am offline, but obviously I'm not, considering that you guys can hear me and see me through the stream. So this is a little weird. Let me try something else, and this might be how we have to do things. Man, this is nuts how slow my computer is being. This makes zero sense, guys. I should fight Google Drive, you're right. Well, I can just, I guess, do this live without having anything on my screen here. Alright, so hopefully if you guys have questions, that would be great. That would really help this go much more smoothly. Otherwise, we're just going to kind of, as I said, do it live. So some of the things that you for sure need to be aware of, right, is Declaration of Independence, right? Declaration of Independence is for sure one of the most important things that you can know. And we went over the Declaration of Independence quite a bit. Let me see if I can actually get a basic Declaration of Independence text up here. But nothing is loading. So maybe, here we go. I can get at least that, it looks like. So, the things that you need to know about the Declaration of Independence, right? You're going to need to know some of the language, for sure. And mostly that language is going to say things like that we are going to have the need for government, right? And government is there to protect the natural rights of the citizens. And the natural rights, it looks like I'm making some headway on loading something anyway. Sorry guys, this is really disoriented here because of this. Anyway, natural rights, right? The life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that in order to protect those rights, that government is created by the people, right? To protect those rights, and that government ultimately gets its power from the consent of the governed, and this is a really important thought, an important thing. And actually, it looks like I might be making some headway. Ooh, I got the declaration here. Here we go. All right, so this. Let me see if I can make this bigger. Right when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There is your natural rights, right? And those come from John Locke. John Locke is the big proponent of natural rights, and he is going to be drawn a lot from for Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, right? He goes on to say that to secure these rights, governments are created by the people, right? And that government gets its power from the consent of government, which I was just talking about before. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these, it is ultimately going to be the right of the people to get rid of said government, right? So by getting rid of that government, it is their right, it is their duty to kind of instill a government that's going to be effective for their needs and to kind of meet this social contract that we had talked about in class. So that is the big thing, right? It also goes to talk about all the things that the king had done that they were not particularly happy about, right? The American colonies. And we went through a bunch of them, but things like closing the port of Boston, in particular after the Boston Tea Party, if you remember that, right? The king basically ignoring all of their different petitions. You also get the thing with, the quartering of troops in Boston. You have the protecting of British officials by trials that were more or less fake in order to be able to basically shelter them from the harsh punishments that would come from American colonists. The whole taxation without representation right there. And then it goes and says that the United States should ultimately be an independent country and have all of the rights that independent countries should have, right? And this is something that's really important. The other Enlightenment stuff that we can talk about, let's see if I can get the PowerPoint up now. I think my computer seems to be acting a little better, and this will make this a lot smoother. I'm sorry, I'm not doing this live very well here. Well, I got a website up, so the website will at least act as something. Okay. So you can follow along on your screen, which will help things be a little faster. It looks like my pictures are not loading here, but the text has, which again will work. Okay, so to start things off, right, we talked about the French and Indian War, and the French and Indian War is really important because it is kind of the precursor to the American Revolution, right? That if you remember, the French were in in the Ohio River Valley and western Pennsylvania area, and the Americans, as they kind of grow and expand westward, and the French kind of come down the Mississippi River and head east, they're going to be a bit of clashing there, right? And when this war breaks out, the British are not going to do particularly well early on in the war against the French. In fact, the French are going to more or less trounce them. They kind of completely push off George Washington and a bunch of his men in Pennsylvania, and then a year later they're going to continue to fight the British. They're actually going to end up killing one of the major generals for the British, a man named Braddock, and things just don't go well, and it's going to ultimately take kind of a reprioritization of the French and of the war for the British, against the French, to kind of change the strategy, send new resources and new officials and things like in order to help the British gain the upper hand and ultimately win. And they're going to win at what's called the Battle of Quebec up in what is modern day Canada, right? So after the war, you are going to have the British looking to looking to get the war paid for, right? And in order to do that, they begin to tax the colonists. And the early taxes are going to be the Sugar Act, right? Which is going to help put tax on things like molasses, which molasses was, if you remember, used in the triangular trade. People are going to start to smuggle it quite a bit as a result of this and trying to avoid the taxes, and the British don't like that. There's going to be a lot of kind of quarrels back and forth because of that. They're going to get that repealed as the Americans kind of push back, and you're going to get a new tax on with legal documents and things known as the Stamp Act in 1765. You're going to get, again, kind of resistance through things like tarring and feathering of officials. And eventually you're going to have some other taxes, but the only other one that I really need you to know about is this Tea Act. And the Tea Act is going to be the precursor for the Boston Tea Party, which we'll get to in a second, right? And the other thing that comes out of the French and Indian War is this Proclamation of 1763. And this proclamation, if you remember, is this line that is drawn essentially down the Appalachian Mountains, and the American colonists are told effectively that they are unable to colonize beyond that line, and that's a bit of a problem for the Americans. They don't really like this. That's mostly the result of they just fought a war against the French, and they thought was that by fighting that war and then winning that war that they would be able to now push into this territory where they had fought this war in the first place. And part of the reason why the British didn't want them going into that area was that there were some relatively hostile Native Americans, and they didn't want to have to protect the colonists as they settled west, right? So resistance came in a couple different ways. We talked about smuggling goods to avoid taxes. You're going to have the tarring and feathering of tax collectors. You're going to have raiding of homes of British officials and people sympathetic to the British, burning effigies, stuffed dolls that were meant to represent the officials, trying to scare them to not do their job, essentially. We talked about the Boston Massacre, right? The Boston Massacre is this instance in Boston where, with tensions riding high as a result of the Quartering Act and the quartering of British troops in Boston, you're going to get what's known as this Boston Massacre. And it's hard to maybe call 5 deaths a massacre, but that's the language that's going to be used by Paul Revere. Becomes known as the Bloody Massacre, right? And the Bloody Massacre is used more or less as propaganda, as a campaign to kind of influence colonists towards anger of British and then pushing them towards the independence movement, right? And that's a pretty big deal because they're able to get more and more people to become patriots and people that are going to be pushing for independence, right? And we know about the Boston Massacre that the Americans aren't necessarily 100% innocent here. There was a lot of provocation going on. They were throwing snow, stones, and sticks, insulting the British soldiers. And while undoubtedly the British escalated things, that is, that's it's worth knowing. It's important to know. So we talked about the Boston Tea Party next, right? In response to the passing of the Tea Act, you're going to have the Sons of Liberty who are going to get together and they are going to boycott the British tea. And they throw a bunch of this tea into the harbor in Boston, and the British don't like that too much at all either, right? So they pass what's known as the Intolerable Acts, which is a series of 5 different things at least, but the big one that I need you to know about is the closing down the port of Boston for the American people there, right? So after the Boston Tea Party, you are going to get the First Continental Congress, and this is a meeting of the colonies to kind of discuss what they're doing with the British, right? And this discussion is kind of a decision that they're going to show solidarity together, right? They're going to kind of boycott British goods. They're going to hurt the British financially, but they're also going to make a decision that if any of the colonies are kind of attacked by the British or war breaks out, then most of the colonies, all the colonies are going to kind of join, right? And this solidarity is pretty important going forward as this group that's going to be united. So, continuing tensions in in Boston from the British being there, and with tensions rising high, you're going to get people that begin preparing for escalations of violence, really, right? And a war breaking out. So when militia are basically known to be stockpiling weapons in Massachusetts, not that far from Boston, the British go to try to capture it, right? Try to take these, to try to not let these weapons fall in the hands of potential revolutionaries, right? So they head there, right? And on their way, the militia or Minutemen are going to try to stop them, right? And this is where the fighting is going to break out for the American Revolution. In what's known as the shot heard round the world, you are going to get a shot fired by no one really knows who, and it's going to start, right? So this is going to stall the British long enough that the weapons are going to be removed from Concord. And when the British get there, they find nothing. They turn around, head back to Boston, and the American Minutemen and militia show up again, and they start shooting at the British, this time with a lot more people, and the British are going to be forced to run and retreat all the way back to Boston and take fairly heavy casualties, actually, which is kind of a bit of a morale boost for the American militia here, right? So we also talked about the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment's influence on the American Revolution. We talked about 2 people in particular, right? Thomas Paine and John Locke. John Locke, we already kind of mentioned with my haphazard going over the Declaration of Independence while I was waiting for things to load. But his ideas about sovereignty and the rights of people were extremely radical at the time, right? And these radical thoughts about government getting its power from the people were deeply admired by many of the American founders, and Locke very deeply challenged the way things had been for a really long period of time, right? And people liked that. So anyway, he wrote about the natural rights, which we already covered, talked about the government being a social contract, and getting his consent from the people, and so on. So we just did that, and remembered that the Declaration of Independence is going to draw heavily on John Locke's writings, and Thomas Jefferson is responsible for the Declaration of Independence, right? So, other person you need to know about is Thomas Paine and Common Sense. And we watched a cartoon in class to kind of talk about that. We also did a quick little work assignment about it, right? But the big thing is that the Common Sense pamphlet is something that many Americans are going to see in the time period, and it's going to help contribute to this idea that American colonies can be independent. They don't actually need the British, right? For many different reasons. Things like the king and Britain being so far away, it makes absolutely no sense for them to be using them as their government head, right? If messages take 3 months, out to get there, and then 3 months back, and we're talking 6 months of travel just to get messages back and forth. It's crazy. The American colonies were extremely rich. Resource-wise, they didn't necessarily need the British, is what Thomas Paine is arguing, right? And so on and so on. So All right, and we already kind of went through the Declaration of Independence, so I'm going to skip this a bit. If you want to read it again from this site, which you should be able to get to from our Google Classroom, that is great. But the big grievances we talked about, right? Taxation without representation, quartering of troops in homes, closing off the port of Boston, the king ignoring them essentially, even though, as they say, they were trying to be as polite as they can essentially in their petitions. And there's obviously tons of others, right? And when it comes down to it, those grievances are often going to coincide with what Thomas Paine had written in Common Sense. Okay? So, now that we've officially kind of talked about the precursors up to the war, let's talk about the war itself, right? So, you are going to get the Second Continental Congress after Lexington and Concord, right? Because the Continental Congress is going to decide that they need to be ready for when the British retaliate and if a war fully breaks out. So they decide George Washington is going to be given command of the army, and they dispatch him immediately up to Boston. And George Washington is this kind of larger-than-life figure, obviously for a number of different reasons, partially because of his leadership during the war, but also his presidency and so on. But his leadership during the Revolution is going to be really important for keeping things together, right? And you can question kind of his military strategy and things, but undoubtedly his leadership is going to help keep the army going and keep the army together through some really tough times, and that is unbelievably important, and you can't really overstate that enough. So when George Washington heads up to Boston, right, his leadership decisions are going to effectively help force a retreat of the British up to Canada for this winter, and that's pretty big deal. That the British, who had complete control of Boston, are going to be forced to leave because of Washington's actions of getting some cannons up on a pretty large hill overseeing Boston Harbor, where it could shoot upon the British Navy. The British were forced to retreat. They couldn't have their ships destroyed, and so they left. They gathered up all the people that were loyal, that they could anyway, all the troops, and they jetted out of Boston. So they wintered up there, and ultimately, they're going to come down to New York, right, the year later, after the Declaration of Independence is signed. Remember that Boston and everything is going on right before the Declaration of Independence is even signed. So we're talking 1775 after Lexington and Concord. So anyway, the year later, in the summer, after the Declaration of Independence, you're going to get a campaign in New York by the British, and they're going to steamroll the Americans on Long Island. They're going to force them west into New York City. They're going to be forced to retreat out of Brooklyn, right? And George Washington is helping and responsible for making those decisions to kind of live to fight another day. Even though the Americans get kind of stomped here, that it's really important, because what you get next is kind of this 1-2 punch, right, of the Americans in basically taking the Hessians in Trenton, right, on Christmas Day of 1776, and then winning another battle in Princeton, New Jersey, not that long later. And this is going to really increase morale of the American troops quite a bit, and it's going to help a lot of people re-enlist, essentially, in the army after these really low points of being forced out of New York, right? So that's really important. So going forward another year, after this, so now this would be 1777. You're going to have more fighting down near Philadelphia. Ultimately, the Americans are going to lose Philadelphia, which is the capital of the colonies at this point, and that hurts quite a bit. We talked about Valley Forge, which is that winter where there's this really tough winter for the Americans, and they're going to come out of it quite a bit stronger for a number of different reasons. But they're going to be drilled like a European army. They're going to learn discipline and things like that. And after this winter at Valley Forge, things are going to start looking up quite a bit more for the Americans, no matter, even if it's going to be really tough still going forward. And in fact, that year, you're going to get what's known as the turning point of the war at a battle up in northern New York known as Saratoga, where the colonists, the army is able to stop a British army from heading south down the Hudson River and cutting off the northern colonies from the rest of the other colonies. They force a major British army and army general to surrender. And once this occurs, the French actually see this as a possible win for the American colonists, and they start to get heavily involved after Ben Franklin negotiates what's known as the Treaty of Alliance. And in this Treaty of Alliance, the French promise monetary support, they promise military support through an army and navy, and the war had at this point was beginning to drag on for the British and started to be very costly. So people in Britain were starting to kind of think, hey, this war really isn't all that fun, and that we should stop doing this. And that lack of popular support is going to ultimately be one of the big things that leads to the British stopping the war a number of years later, right? So after this turning point of the war, if you will, you're going to have the British kind of re-evaluate what they need to do. And their strategy is going to come down to them heading south. And when they head south, the thought is that they're going to be able to take advantage of a lot of loyalist people down in the south, right? I think I haven't actually talked about this super specifically. But you have loyalists, who are people that are going to remain loyal to the British and the king. You have patriots, who are people that are looking for independence, right? And then you have neutrals, and neutrals are effectively people that are not necessarily decided on who they're going to support in this. And there were more people that were neutral or loyal than patriots to start off this war. But anyway, back to the war here. This campaign goes pretty rough for the Americans early on. The British are able to take South Carolina and a major port in South Carolina known as Charleston, and they're going to kind of slowly work their way north, and with British still also around the New York area, they're going to try to kind of pinch George Washington in the middle. But it doesn't actually work out for General Cornwallis, who is going to end up positioning his army at Yorktown a number of years after they started the Southern campaign, and hoping to resupply on the coast before continuing, pushing Washington. He tries, right? And Washington sees this as a perfect opportunity, and he engages the British and lays siege to them at what's called Yorktown. And the reason why this is such a big deal is because the British, who would normally have just kind of hopped in their boats and left, they're actually cut off by the French and the French Navy, who had pledged that support, right? And when the French cut them off at here and they don't allow this retreat from the sea, the British now lose another army to the Americans, right? And the British are forced to surrender under General Cornwallis. And after this point, the war is again proving too costly. The British people are going to start losing that popular support even more, and this is it. That's the end of the American Revolution at Yorktown, the surrender at Yorktown. So the peace treaty will not be signed for a couple of years in 1783 with what is known as the Treaty of Paris. And effectively, while there's some other parts to the treaty, the only things that I'm going to require you to know, right, is that it's going to recognize the United States as its own independent country, just like the Declaration of Independence was asking for. And you're also going to have America's western borders, not even western borders, but borders essentially be what the British colonies were in the New World, right? In the New World, heck, just call them the colonies, or America, or North America at this point. The western border is going to be set at the Mississippi River, and the Americans did not gain Canada from this. The British colonies in Canada are going to remain British, and they're going to continue to be a thorn in the side for the Americans for a number of years, and will be a point of contention to lead us to war really only 30 to 40 years after this going forward. So that's kind of it. I'm sorry this was kind of a little screwy there in the beginning, but I'm glad I was able to at least load this text to kind of help me give me an outline of what to talk about anyway. the PowerPoint that I pointed to in Google Classroom is a real good starting point as well. You can listen to me go over those notes from YouTube as well, which is a link that I posted in Google Classroom. So other than that, I don't know what else to talk about. So if no one else has any more questions, we'll be calling it a night, and I'm going to try to restart this computer, and hopefully I won't have issues like that in the future. But I am definitely laggy and definitely getting problems with dropped frames and things like that. So hopefully you guys could understand me, and it wasn't too bad. So if no more questions, I'm signing off in about 30 seconds to give you guys a chance. 8,800 dropped frames according to my software that allows me to stream. That's a lot. Anyway, alright, since no one's asking any more questions, I guess we're calling it a night. Thanks guys, have a good night, good luck studying, and such.